Egypt is a country with a lot of social and political unrest. Things in Egypt took a turn for the worse in 2011 when they had problems stemming from corruption in their government. Things haven't always been that bad in Egypt.
In ancient Egypt, government officials weren't as corrupt as they are now. The reason that they weren't corrupt is because of Ma'at. Ma'at led them to believe that they had to follow all of its rules or they'd be poverty-stricken, have bad luck, or it would lead to blindness.
Egyptian laws are once based on their views of right from wrong from Ma'at, which is the ancient concept of truth, balance, law, morality, and justice. Egypt's major leader was the pharaoh. He was considered to be the living god and he controlled all aspects of Egyptian society. Egyptians had a complex system of polytheistic beliefs. These played a role in their political systems because they based their laws off of their beliefs. For example, Ma'at.
Although the pharaoh was the official leader of all things in ancient Egyptian society, he wasn't able to rule over all disputes between all citizens. He had his men rule over certain disputes. They wouldn't always rule the same way in disputes, so their laws weren't always the same, and you would get different punishments or different reactions depending on who was governing over it. Although things in Egypt are supposed to be more structured now, it might not always seem that way. Because of the mass amount of corruption in Egypt, people are able to buy the outcome that they want in their legal proceedings.
As time passed, Egypt became a republic. Their new political and legal system was based off of models from Britain and Italy. Most people in Egypt are Muslim now. This plays a role in their laws because people who are Muslim have to follow Muslim laws. According to TorahEgypt.net, everyone in Egypt was considered to be equal under the law, except for slaves, of course. But if someone committed a crime, their family would be punished for the crime that they committed as well. For things like embezzlement, punishment could be something as simple as repaying what was taken, but double the price.
Punishments for other crimes in India included beatings or branding to mark dishonor. In cases that were more serious, people were sometimes banished to the Western Oasis or labor camps. In cases that required capital punishment, people were drowned, burned alive, or decapitated.
Currently in Egypt, they have three categories for criminal offenses: contraventions, misdemeanors, and felonies. The Muslim Brotherhood wanted to enact Sharia law in Egypt, but that was denied because most of their laws already complied.
Women in Egypt were treated considerably well considering how women in other societies were treated during this time. Women were allowed to get divorced from their husbands, but they had to, in a legal proceeding, state that they hated living with their husbands. They had to give up all rights to any money or rights that they had from their husbands, and they had to pay back any dowry that was paid for the marriage. When a wife divorces her husband, she's now allowed to file for child support and child custody from her husband.
Prior to the 7th century, all legal proceedings were oral. Now legal proceedings are written down and they are used in court to help dispute problems that arise.
As well as legal codes and political institutions, the social structure of both ancient and modern-day Egypt is rich. As to most civilizations, there were distinct levels of social class. According to ushistory.org, the Egyptian society was structured like a pyramid. At the top were the gods such as Ra, Osiris, and Isis. Egyptians believed that the gods controlled the universe, therefore it was important to keep them happy. They could make the Nile overflow, cause famine, or even bring death. The leaders were the pharaohs, and they had many responsibilities. Below that were the nobles and priests, and only they could hold government posts. Next were the scribes, merchants, artisans, and farmers. And last in the pyramid were slaves and servants. Slaves were prisoners of war. Social mobility was not impossible. Peasants and farmers could move up the ladder. Additionally, religion was also a very big part of the Egyptians' day-to-day life. According to History Museum, in Egypt, before the concept of God existed, magical power was encapsulated in the hieroglyph or scepter, which is a rod or staff. This is one of the most enduring symbols of divine power, ever present in images of the pharaohs and the gods. Gods were in a personalized form, and every Egyptian town had a particular deity. Gods represented in the shape of an animal, like a cat or a jackal. They believed death was a temporary interruption rather than a cessation of life. To ensure life after death, they paid homage to the gods, and also they mummified their people in order to have their soul returned to the body. A surprising aspect of Egyptian history is the role of women. According to Cornell University, they enjoyed the same legal and economic rights. Disparities between legal rights depended upon social class and not gender. Women could manage, own, and sell private property, which included slaves, land, portable goods, servants, livestock, and money. Women could resolve legal settlements. They could conclude any kind of legal settlement. Women could appear as a contracting partner in a marriage contract or a divorce contract. They could execute testaments, they could free slaves, and they could make adoptions. Women were entitled to sue at law. The amount of freedom was at variance with that of the Greek women, who required a designated male called a kurios to represent or stand for her in all legal contracts and proceedings. This male was her husband, father, or brother. Art and music was a large part of Egyptian culture. The pyramids were great monuments and tombs for the kings. Depicted in tomb and temple drawings are scenes of everyday living, models of people and animals, glass figures and containers, and jewelry made from gold and semi-precious stones. Religion was often the subject of Egyptian literature. Prayers and hymns were written in praise of the gods. The most important book was the Book of the Dead. This book contained over 200 prayers and magic formulas that taught the Egyptians how to reach a happy afterlife. The Egyptians also wrote stories, fairy tales, myths, love stories, poems, proverbs, and quotes. Unfortunately, Egypt has a few current political problems. Widespread Middle East unrest in 2000 loosed grievances against the 30-year autocratic rule of President Hosni Mubarak, who was ousted following a dramatic period of protests that became a watershed moment in the Arab Spring. The upheaval paved the way for the country's first free parliamentary elections, in which the Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohamed Morsi was elected president. Subsequent protests against Morsi's authoritarianism led to a 2013 military coup and the election of former General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi as president in 2014. Additionally, there has been political violence in 2014. The 2014 military takeover is making the government more oppressive, and in December 2014, 6 protesters were killed.
January the 25th, 2011, the Arab Spring spreads to Egypt with a day of rage.
Freedom! And we're gonna take our freedom!
We saw something I've never seen before, a phalanx of men on horseback and on camels, and they charged through from the pro-regime side directly into the opposition.
After 18 days of violence, celebrations as it was announced President Hosni Mubarak's 30-year rule had come to an end.
President Mohammed Hosni Mubarak has decided to step down as president of Egypt.
The military assumed control of the country, and Egyptians began to vote on their future. Within a month, they'd overwhelmingly approved a referendum to amend the constitution, limiting presidential terms to 4 years. In November, parliamentary elections were held, with Islamist parties ultimately winning about 70% of seats. Next came the historic presidential election. It was held in May 2012, and the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohamed Morsi was finally declared the first freely elected president on June the 24th. But within 6 months, Egyptians were once again back on the streets after their new leader issued an order preventing courts from overturning his decisions. President Morsi later reversed his decree, but the damage was done, with his opponents accusing him of betraying the Egyptian people. Amid the political instability, the country's economic situation also worsened, and opposition voices grew louder, culminating in mass protests on June 30th this year, the first anniversary of President Morsi's win in the election. Their calls for a snap presidential election won the support of the military, which 3 days later ousted Morsi from power. But supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood leader have defiantly remained on the streets in protest, demanding he be reinstated.
And now some of his supporters are talking about the possibility of war.
After 6 weeks of ongoing unrest, Egyptian security forces have now moved in on the makeshift camps of pro-Morsi protesters. The crackdown resulting in more bloodshed in a country still battling for political and economic stability. 2.5 years since it first rose up demanding democracy. Becky Anderson, CNN, Abu Dhabi.
The extension of law in modern day is related to the revolution of 2011. The emergency law is a modern-day law enacted in 1958 in the country after the 1967 Six-Day War. Emergency law extended police powers, suspended constitutional rights, legalized censorship, and abolished habeas corpus. From 1981 to 2011, President Hosni Mubarak abused this law in order to maintain power in his country. Tired of the constant oppression Egyptians faced, they protested in what was known as the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. The revolution included Islamic, liberal, anti-capitalist, nationalist, and feminist elements. Violent clashes between security forces and protesters resulted in at least 846 people killed and over 6,000 injured. Thus, a few days into the revolution, Mubarak resigned, making his presidency the longest in Egyptian history. Overall, Egypt is a country rich in history, both past and present. From religion to revolutions, it's no wonder why historians have been so fascinated by Egypt since the beginning of the civilization.